In the autumn of 1842, a ball gown lay spread across a mahogany table in Halifax County, Virginia. The velvet was midnight blue, almost black in the candlelight, its silver threading catching the flame like trapped starlight. Every stitch was perfect, every seam invisible, the work of a master seamstress whose needle had never known error. The dress was beautiful beyond measure, and according to local legend, it was also lethal. The woman who wore it, Mistress Lavinia Breyer, had been found dead in her bed 3 days after donning the gown for the first time. Her skin bore strange pinprick marks along her neckline and wrists, as if something sharp had pierced her repeatedly through the fabric. The town doctor called it a nervous fever, but the whispers that followed spoke of something far more sinister. 5 more members of the Breyer family would follow Lavinia to the grave within 2 months, all wearing garments crafted by the same enslaved seamstress named Hester. The authorities searched desperately for poison in food, in water, in medicine. They brought in experts from Richmond, consulted with learned physicians, and even considered supernatural explanations for the mounting deaths. Before we go on, tell me in the comments where you are watching from. If this is your first time here, subscribe, because the story I am about to tell goes beyond anything you can imagine. They never thought to look in the threads themselves, never imagined that death could be woven into fabric with such precision that it became invisible until the moment it struck. The very clothes that proclaimed wealth and status had become instruments of destruction, each garment a masterpiece of both beauty and vengeance. What appeared to be the finest craftsmanship in Virginia was actually the most sophisticated act of resistance the region had ever witnessed. This was not just death by mysterious illness or divine retribution against the wicked. This was an operation that had woven vengeance into the very fabric of the oppressor's world, transforming symbols of power into instruments of justice, one perfect stitch at a time. Briarwood Plantation sat like a festering wound in the Virginia countryside, 20 miles from the nearest town and surrounded by dense pine forests that seemed to swallow sound and light. The isolation was deliberate, chosen to ensure that the screams from the slave quarters would never reach civilized ears, that the business of human bondage could be conducted without interference from squeamish neighbors. The main house, once a symbol of southern grandeur, showed its decay in peeling white paint and sagging columns wrapped in kudzu vines. The shutters hung askew on rusted hinges, and the wide front porch creaked ominously, even when no one walked across its warped boards. Stains from years of Virginia weather marked the once pristine walls like tears on a ruined face. The estate sprawled across 800 acres of what had once been prime tobacco land, though by 1842 most fields lay fallow and choked with weeds. The soil itself seemed cursed, producing crops that withered before harvest and livestock that sickened for no apparent reason. A perpetual smell hung over the property, sweet and cloying, like flowers left too long in a tomb. Behind the main house, 23 slave cabins squatted in the shadow of dying oak trees. These structures were little more than wooden boxes with gaps between the boards wide enough to let in rain and winter wind. Each cabin housed entire families in spaces barely large enough for one person, with dirt floors that turned to mud whenever it rained. The sewing room occupied a corner of the main house's second floor, its windows facing north to catch the steady light that seamstresses required for fine work. Here, surrounded by bolts of imported silk worth more than most people earned in a lifetime, Hester spent her days creating beauty for people who saw her as property. The irony was not lost on her, this daily reminder of the world she could observe but never inhabit, the luxury she could craft but never enjoy. In this place of silent suffering, the most potent threats were not the ones held in hands, but the ones hidden in plain sight. Master Alistair Breyer ruled his domain with the desperate fury of a man watching his fortune crumble between his fingers. Once among Virginia's wealthiest tobacco planters, he had seen his inheritance evaporate through poor investments in changing markets. His face bore the permanent flush of a man who drank too much whiskey and slept too little, his temper as volatile as summer lightning and twice as dangerous. He spoke constantly of returning the family to its former glory, of reclaiming the respect that the Breyer name had once commanded throughout Virginia. His methods grew more desperate and cruel with each passing season, as he squeezed every possible dollar from his failing enterprise. The enslaved people of Briarwood bore the brunt of his frustration, suffering increased punishments for minor infractions and watching helplessly as their loved ones were sold away to pay mounting debts. Mistress Lavinia Breyer measured her worth in silk and jewelry, spending hours before her gilded mirror adjusting the fit of her countless gowns. Her vanity was legendary even among her peers, her collection of dresses rivaling those of Richmond's finest families despite her husband's declining fortunes. She spoke to her enslaved servants as if they were pieces of furniture, useful when needed and invisible when not. Her cruelty toward the people she owned exceeded even her husband's, manifesting in petty humiliations and calculated torments that served no purpose beyond satisfying her need to feel superior. She would force servants to stand for hours holding mirrors while she dressed, strike them for imaginary infractions, and take particular pleasure in separating families through strategic sales and reassignments. Her greatest pride was her wardrobe, maintained and expanded by a seamstress whose extraordinary skill she took completely for granted. Their daughter Eliza, 18 years old and recently engaged to Richmond society's most eligible bachelor, possessed the thoughtless kindness of someone who had never questioned the world that shaped her. She would offer Hester a glass of water on particularly hot days, or comment pleasantly on the weather while fittings were conducted. Small gestures that cost her nothing but meant everything to someone starved of basic human recognition. These tiny acts of decency would ultimately save her life. Unlike her parents, Eliza had never personally participated in the worst cruelties of plantation life, though she benefited from them daily and never thought to question the source of her comfort. She lived in a bubble of privilege that shielded her from understanding slavery's reality while allowing her to maintain the illusion that she was naturally superior to the people who served her every need. Hester moved through the house like a ghost, her presence noted only when her services were required. She was 35 years old, though the hard labor and constant stress of bondage made her appear older. Her hands, the tools of her trade, remained steady and sure despite years of servitude. Those who looked closely might have noticed the intelligence that burned behind her carefully neutral expression, but the Breyer family never looked closely at their property. Her son Elijah, 10 years old, and possessed of his mother's quiet dignity, spent his days in the shadow of the sewing room when he was not performing his assigned duties. He had learned to read from discarded newspapers and possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of the Bible from the traveling preacher who visited twice yearly. The boy had developed a persistent cough that worried his mother more with each passing day. What Hester did not yet know was that Alistair Breyer had already signed the papers to sell the boy to a sugar plantation in New Orleans. The transaction was scheduled for completion immediately after Eliza's wedding celebration, turning a moment of family joy into the destruction of another family entirely. But Hester's quiet endurance was about to break, and the catalyst would be the most celebrated event the house had seen in years. The previous spring, something had happened at Briarwood that should have served as a warning to anyone with eyes to see. James Rourke, the plantation's brutal overseer, had torn his trousers on a fence post while chasing down a runaway and brought the damaged garment to Hester for mending. The man took particular pleasure in his authority over the enslaved workers, using his whip with enthusiasm that had earned him a reputation for cruelty throughout the county. Rourke had arrived at the plantation 2 years earlier with recommendations from other tobacco estates and a philosophy that stressed maintaining discipline through fear. He carried a leather whip braided with wire and took pride in the distinctive scars it left on human flesh. The enslaved people of Briarwood had learned to recognize his footsteps. From a quarter-mile away, the heavy boots that announced his approach, like the hoofbeats of one of the 4 horsemen. Hester repaired the tear with her usual skill, using thread that matched the fabric so perfectly that the mend was virtually invisible. She returned the garments within a day, as was expected of her, and Rourke put them on immediately, eager to resume his rounds of intimidation and violence. Within hours of donning the mended trousers, he began complaining of an intense itching sensation that seemed to emanate from his legs and spread upward. By evening, angry red welts covered his skin, and he was scratching himself raw despite the pain. The irritation grew steadily worse throughout the night, accompanied by a burning fever that left him delirious and raving. By morning, Rourke was convinced that he had been the victim of conjure work, that someone had placed a curse on his clothing using root magic. He spent 2 weeks confined to his bed, scratching his skin until it bled and babbling about voodoo and poisoned needles. When he finally recovered enough to present his accusations to the Briar family, his claims were taken seriously enough to warrant investigation. Hester was questioned extensively about her methods and materials. Her sewing supplies searched for suspicious items. The investigation ultimately concluded that Rourke's illness had been caused by some kind of allergic reaction. The Briar family dismissed the overseer's accusations as superstitious ravings. Hester received a mild punishment of 10 lashes that she bore in complete silence, her face revealing nothing of the satisfaction that burned in her chest. The incident was recorded in the plantation ledger as a medical expense and quickly forgotten by the white residents of Briarwood. But in the slave quarters, knowing glances were exchanged among people who understood exactly what they had witnessed. The enslaved people of Briarwood recognized that Hester possessed knowledge passed down through generations, secrets about roots and herbs that white doctors had never studied. The overseer's illness had not been coincidence or divine retribution or allergic reaction. It had been a test, carefully calculated and expertly executed, a proof of concept that demonstrated the feasibility of using domestic skills as weapons of war. The test had worked perfectly, confirming that the oppressor's blindness to their servants' capabilities could be exploited to devastating effect. It was a rehearsal for something much larger and more terrible, a preview of the vengeance that was already taking shape in Hester's mind. The real performance was yet to come. In the summer of 1841, salvation seemed to arrive at Briarwood in the form of a marriage proposal. Eliza Briar had captured the attention of Marcus Whitmore, heir to a Richmond tobacco fortune and one of Virginia's most eligible bachelors. The engagement promised not only romantic fulfillment for their daughter, but financial rescue for the entire family. The engagement represented far more than simple romance. It offered the prospect of financial rescue for an entire family whose mounting debts and declining revenues had pushed them to the very brink of social disgrace and economic collapse. Marcus Whitmore was not merely wealthy, but connected to the network of merchants, bankers, and politicians who controlled Virginia's economy. Lavinia threw herself into wedding preparations with manic enthusiasm, determined to stage an event that would restore their social standing and announce their return to prosperity. The celebration would require new wardrobes for the entire family, outfits grand enough to impress Richmond society and erase any whispers about the Briar family's recent struggles. She summoned Hester to her chambers and spread fabric samples across her bed like a general planning a campaign. silk from China, velvet from France, lace from Belgium, all purchased on credit that the family could ill afford. Lavinia wanted a complete transformation, a wardrobe that would proclaim wealth and status with every thread. For Hester, the commission represented months of intensive labor, working by candlelight long after the main house had gone to sleep. She would create not just wedding clothes, but an entire collection of formal wear designed to dazzle and impress. The irony was crushing, using her skills to celebrate the very system that held her in bondage. But as she accepted bolts of expensive fabric and began sketching designs, Hester discovered something that changed everything. While organizing papers in Alistair's study, she found a bill of sale bearing a familiar name. Elijah, age 10, sold to a New Orleans sugar plantation for $800. The transaction was scheduled for completion after the wedding festivities concluded. The document was written in the same casual tone used for selling livestock, with no acknowledgement that the property in question was a human child, with feelings, fears, and a mother who loved him more than life itself. The sale would separate her from her son forever, sending him to work in sugar fields, where children rarely survived to adulthood. She would never see him again, never know if he lived or died, never have the chance to say goodbye. The discovery hit her like a physical blow, driving the breath from her lungs and sending waves of rage coursing through her body with an intensity that threatened to consume her completely. For 35 years, she had endured slavery with stoic determination, accepting her fate and protecting her sanity by focusing on small daily victories rather than dwelling on the larger injustice of her situation. But this was different. This was not about her own suffering, but about the destruction of the one thing in the world that gave her life meaning. They could beat her, humiliate her, work her to exhaustion, and deny her every basic human dignity, but they could not be allowed to steal her child. With the wedding deadline looming and her son's future already stolen and sold, Hester needed allies who shared her understanding of botanical warfare. If this is your first time here, subscribe, but only if you honestly enjoy what we do here, because the network she was about to activate had been preparing for this moment for decades. Hester's needle would no longer be merely a tool of service, but an instrument of war in a conflict that only she understood was being fought. Deep in the pine woods behind the slave quarters, where Spanish moss hung from ancient branches like funeral shrouds, an elderly woman named Old May tended a garden that most people instinctively avoided. Her gnarled hands, twisted by arthritis into shapes that resembled the roots she cultivated, could no longer hold a needle steady enough for sewing or stir a pot without spilling its contents. But those same hands could still identify every toxic plant that grew in Virginia soil, knowledge that stretched back through generations to the forests of Africa itself. May had been the plantation's unofficial doctor for more than 4 decades, delivering babies who would grow up in bondage and easing the deaths of those who could no longer endure their suffering. She possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of botanical medicine that had been passed down through an unbroken chain of healers, each generation adding to the accumulated wisdom of roots, leaves, bark, and berries that could cure or kill depending on how they were prepared and administered. The old woman's garden was arranged according to principles that white people would never understand, with healing plants carefully separated from those that brought death, protective herbs forming barriers around dangerous specimens, and everything organized according to lunar cycles and seasonal rhythms that governed the potency of natural medicines. Visitors who stumbled into her domain reported feeling dizzy and nauseous, effects that May attributed to the spiritual energy that protected her plants from interference. When Hester came to her in the dark hours before dawn, moving through the forest like a shadow to avoid detection by patrollers, May understood immediately what was being asked. The younger woman's face told the story without need for words. Desperation, determination, and a rage so pure it seemed to glow in the darkness, like phosphorus on rotting wood. Together they walked through the garden in complete silence, the old woman pointing out specimens with hands that trembled but never wavered. Wolf's bane, with its clusters of blue flowers, beautiful enough to grace a lady's dining table, but containing alkaloids that could stop a human heart within hours of ingestion. Poison hemlock, whose delicate white blooms concealed enough toxin in their cells to kill a dozen people, the same plant that had ended the life of Socrates in ancient Athens. There were others, dozens of species that could bring death in forms ranging from sudden cardiac arrest to slow-wasting diseases that mimicked natural illness. Plants that could paralyze breathing, poison blood, or destroy the nervous system with such subtlety that even experienced physicians would struggle to identify the cause of death. May knew them all, understood their properties as completely as a master chef understands spices. The method that Hester devised, working in consultation with May's vast knowledge, was diabolical in its elegance and virtually impossible to detect using the medical knowledge available in 1840 Virginia. She would create tiny implements no larger than thorns, carved from bone splinters and coated with concentrated plant toxins, then sew them into the seams and linings of garments, where they would pierce the wearer's skin through normal movement and activity. The punctures would be too small and numerous to notice individually, easily dismissed as normal chafing or irritation from new clothes. The poisoned bone fragments would dissolve gradually in body heat and moisture, releasing their deadly cargo directly into the bloodstream while leaving no physical evidence behind. Even if a physician suspected foul play, they would find nothing more incriminating than perfectly normal sewing supplies. For additional effectiveness, she would treat fabric linings with powdered irritants and concentrated pollens that would be absorbed through skin contact and inhaled with every breath. The combination created a sophisticated delivery system that turned clothing itself into a weapon, slow-acting enough to avoid immediate suspicion but absolutely certain in its ultimate effect. Her accomplice in this deadly enterprise was Corinthia, the plantation's head cook, whose domain extended far beyond the kitchen to include significant influence throughout the main house. A woman of few words, but profound intelligence, she had spent years observing the Breyer family's habits and weaknesses, cataloging information that could be used against them when the time came for action. Corinthia's role was to ensure that the family's meals contained just enough harmless herbs and mild purgatives to create digestive distress that would mask the early symptoms of poisoning. The resulting confusion about the true cause of their declining health would buy precious time for the toxins to work, while deflecting suspicion away from any single source. Working by candlelight in her sewing room during the long hours after midnight, when the main house slept and only she remained awake, Hester began transforming each commissioned garment into an instrument of death. Every stitch was placed with mathematical precision, every seam reinforced to ensure that the deadly implements would remain exactly where she positioned them until they could fulfill their purpose. She sang softly as she worked, old spirituals that her grandmother had taught her, melodies that carried prayers for justice and promises of deliverance across generations of suffering. The songs helped her maintain the rhythm necessary for such delicate work while connecting her to ancestors who had survived their own versions of hell through faith and determination. Each garment became a masterpiece of both beauty and vengeance, outwardly magnificent enough to satisfy Lavinia's vanity, while inwardly containing enough poison to kill everyone who wore it. The dresses that would proclaim the Breyer family's return to prominence would actually announce their departure from the world of the living. The machine was set in motion with clockwork precision, and its first victim would be the woman who prized beautiful clothing above all other earthly possessions. Lavinia Breyer donned her new midnight blue ball gown on a Tuesday evening in June, preening before her mirror as she admired Hester's craftsmanship. The dress fit perfectly, accentuating her figure while maintaining the elaborate style required for formal occasions. She felt beautiful and powerful, ready to reclaim her place among Richmond's social elite. The gown's construction represented months of intensive labor, with hand-sewn details that would have impressed European royalty and finishing techniques that demonstrated mastery of needlework arts. Every element had been designed to showcase Lavinia's status and wealth, while creating the kind of visual impact that would dominate any social gathering. For 2 days, Lavinia wore the gown to dinner and social calls, basking in compliments from neighbors who marveled at the quality of the workmanship. She made mental notes about which details drew the most admiring comments, planning to incorporate similar elements into future commissions. But by Thursday morning, she began complaining of a peculiar pricking sensation around her neckline and wrists, as if something sharp kept poking her through the fabric. She examined the dress carefully but found nothing amiss, attributing the discomfort to nerves about the upcoming wedding preparations. Dr. Ignatius Wells arrived Friday afternoon to find his patient feverish and agitated, scratching constantly at invisible irritants. A man of science and learning, he diagnosed a nervous fever brought on by excitement and prescribed rest and laudanum. The symptoms seemed to match dozens of similar cases he had treated over the years. A house slave, a child of perhaps 7 years, approached the doctor as he prepared to leave. The boy whispered that he had seen Hester, singing to the clothes, holding them up to her face, and speaking words he could not understand. Dr. Wells dismissed this as childish imagination, the kind of superstitious nonsense that flourished among the uneducated. The doctor made no mention of the conversation in his notes, considering it beneath the attention of serious medical professionals who dealt in facts rather than fairy tales. He attributed the child's account to primitive thinking that characterized people whose limited education left them vulnerable to magical explanations for natural phenomena. By Sunday, Lavinia was dead, her body bearing mysterious pinprick marks that the doctor attributed to fevered scratching. The coroner's report noted the unusual dermal markings, but offered no explanation beyond complications of nervous exhaustion. In the quarters, people nodded knowingly but said nothing aloud. The first coffin was closed, and a new, more terrifying question emerged. Who would be next to feel the touch of Hester's deadly needle? Alistair Breyer's decline began 3 weeks after his wife's funeral, symptoms appearing gradually enough to seem like natural grief. He complained of fatigue, shortness of breath, and a burning sensation in his chest that no amount of whiskey could ease. The new vest Hester had crafted for the wedding fit him perfectly, its rich burgundy fabric making him appear prosperous and dignified. He wore this vest daily, taking comfort in its elegant appearance and the way it made his shoulders appear broader, while concealing the physical deterioration that was beginning to undermine his ability to present himself as a man worthy of respect and continued social prominence. When the master of Briarwood took to his bed, with what appeared to be the same mysterious ailment that had claimed his wife, panic gripped the household. Dr. Wells returned, bringing with him Sheriff Thomas Crawford and a growing suspicion that something unnatural was occurring at the plantation. Sheriff Crawford possessed the kind of methodical, suspicious mind that was well suited to detecting patterns that might escape others. His years of experience had taught him that murder often wore disguises that could fool even intelligent observers who lacked specific knowledge about criminal methods and motivations. The investigation began with a systematic search of the slave quarters. Teams of armed men with lanterns and dogs turning over every possession in search of poison bottles, conjure bags, or other evidence of malevolent practice. They examined cooking pots for residue, checked water sources for contamination, and questioned every resident about their knowledge of roots, herbs, and folk remedies. The searchers found nothing more threatening than herb bundles used for seasoning food and treating minor ailments. Plant materials that seemed entirely harmless to investigators whose knowledge of botanical medicine was limited. They discovered no voodoo dolls, no bottles of mysterious liquids, no evidence of the organized conspiracy they had expected to uncover. Hester's sewing room received particularly intensive attention, with Sheriff Crawford examining every tool and material with the focused intensity of a man hunting for murder weapons. He held needles up to candlelight looking for traces of suspicious substances, sniffed at bolts of fabric searching for unusual odors, and questioned her extensively about every herb and powder in her possession. She responded to each inquiry with calm patience and respectful deference, explaining the purpose of every item in terms that any experienced housewife would understand. Her collection of dried plants was for brewing medicinal teas, she explained. The various powders were for removing stains and preserving expensive materials against moths and other pests. The small bones were tools for creating custom-fitting aids, standard equipment among skilled seamstresses. Every explanation made perfect sense. Every item had an obvious and innocent purpose, and Hester's manner throughout the interrogation remained consistently helpful and cooperative. The sheriff departed frustrated and empty-handed, his report concluding that no evidence of malicious activity had been discovered among the enslaved population. The failure to identify obvious suspects or methods left authorities grasping for alternative explanations. Theories ranged from environmental contamination to hereditary weakness to supernatural intervention, but none provided clear answers that would allow them to prevent further deaths or bring criminal charges. With the master of the house on his deathbed, the search for a culprit would turn to the ledger, where the truth was hiding in numbers, not needles. The Briarwood Plantation ledger told a story of decline and desperation, written in columns of debts and diminishing assets. Page after page revealed the systematic collapse of what had once been a thriving agricultural enterprise, mounting bills that exceeded income by devastating margins. The entries for routine expenses painted a picture of a family living far beyond their means, purchasing luxury goods on credit while their primary source of income withered away. Payments for imported fabrics, fine wines, and elaborate furnishings continued, even as receipts from tobacco sales plummeted due to soil depletion, market changes, and Alistair's fundamental inability to adapt to changing conditions. Among the standard entries for seed, equipment, and seasonal labor costs, one line stood out with shocking clarity. One Negro boy, Elijah, age 10, sold to J. Hartwell, New Orleans, $800. The transaction was dated for completion after the wedding celebration, turning a moment of family joy into the destruction of another family entirely. The cold mathematics of this entry reduced a child to a commodity, listing his sale with the same emotional weight as the purchase of a plow. There was no acknowledgement that the property in question had feelings, relationships, or a mother whose world would be destroyed by his departure. The transaction represented pure business calculation, human suffering converted into dollars and cents. The clustering of medical expenses during the final months created a pattern that no one had noticed while living through the events day by day. Doctors' fees, medicines, and treatments formed an increasingly dense concentration of costs that paralleled the family's declining health, each entry marking another step toward the grave, for people who had seemed healthy just months before. Payments to Dr. Wells alone totaled more than $50 over 8 weeks, an enormous sum that reflected both the frequency of his visits and the expensive treatments he prescribed for conditions that defied conventional diagnosis. The costs for laudanum, mercury treatments, and imported medications created a financial burden that added significantly to the family's already impossible debt load. Most paradoxically, the only category of expenses that had increased substantially during this period was the family's wardrobe. Lavinia's commission for wedding clothes represented the largest single expenditure in months, money the family could not afford spent on garments designed to create an illusion of prosperity that everyone knew to be false. The contrast between essential needs and frivolous luxuries revealed the twisted priorities of people whose vanity exceeded their common sense. While enslaved workers wore rags and ate scraps, their owners commissioned elaborate gowns made from materials worth more than most families earned in a year. For those who knew how to read between the lines, the ledger told a different story entirely. It revealed the desperation that had driven Alistair Breyer to break up families through slave sales, the greed that had motivated years of cruelty, and the justice that had finally arrived wearing silk and lace. The mathematics of oppression were laid bare in columns of figures that treated human beings as assets to be bought and sold according to market conditions. Every entry represented someone's suffering, someone's loss, someone's family destroyed for the sake of maintaining appearances and paying bills that should never have been incurred. The ledger told a story of greed and collapse, but it could not explain the specific chilling mechanism of the downfall. For that, we need to revisit the night everything fell apart. The autumn of 1842 arrived early at Briarwood, bringing with it a chill that seemed to seep through the walls and settle in human bones. Alistair Breyer died on a Tuesday night in October, his body racked by the same mysterious symptoms that had claimed his wife. His final hours were marked by delirium and pain, his hands clawing constantly at his chest as if trying to remove something that could not be seen. His death throes were witnessed by his daughter Eliza, who sat beside his bed holding his hand while he raved about needles and thread and clothes that burned like fire against his skin. She tried to comfort him with gentle words and cool cloths, but nothing could penetrate the fever that had consumed his mind during his final weeks. In her wedding gown, the elaborate ivory silk creation that Hester had spent months perfecting, Eliza began to feel unwell almost immediately after her father's death. The dress was unquestionably the finest garment ever created at Briarwood, its delicate embroidery and pearl buttons representing hundreds of hours of meticulous labor. The gown was meant to be worn for her December wedding to Marcus Whitmore, a ceremony that would have rescued her family from financial ruin. Instead, she found herself wearing it to her father's deathbed, the symbol of hope transformed into something that seemed cursed by the tragedy surrounding her family. As she knelt beside her dying parent, Eliza noticed a strange tingling sensation where the dress's fitted bodice pressed against her ribs, followed by an inexplicable difficulty in breathing that she initially attributed to grief and exhaustion. The symptoms were subtle at first, easily dismissed as natural responses to emotional trauma. Meanwhile, in the room where Lavinia had spent her final days, something extraordinary occurred that would have changed everything if anyone had been present to witness it. The dead woman's eyes opened for a brief moment, focused with perfect clarity on her own reflection in the bedroom mirror, and in that instant of supernatural awareness, she understood exactly what had been done to her family. Her lips moved soundlessly, forming words that no living person would ever hear, but the message was clear to anyone who could read the language of the dying. She pointed with one trembling finger at the midnight blue gown that lay draped over a chair nearby. then toward the door where Hester waited with funeral clothes, and managed to gasp a single word that contained all the terrible knowledge she had acquired too late. Beautiful. The house itself seemed to exhale as the patriarch died, shadows growing longer and sounds becoming muffled, as if the very walls were absorbing light and noise. Servants moved like ghosts through hallways that felt colder with each passing hour, their whispered conversations carrying undertones of dread and anticipation. Hester, summoned to prepare the bodies for burial, worked with methodical reverence during the pre-dawn hours. She removed each poisoned garment with careful precision, handling the deadly fabrics as if they were sacred relics that deserved respect rather than objects to be discarded carelessly. The instruments of vengeance had served their purpose and would not be allowed to accompany their victims to the grave, lest they contaminate the earth itself with their concentrated hatred. Each dress, vest, and undergarment was folded carefully and set aside for later disposal. Standing alone in the master bedroom, surrounded by the physical evidence of her systematic revenge, Hester felt no triumph or satisfaction, only the hollow peace that comes when justice has finally been served after decades of patient waiting. The machine of oppression had been turned against itself, its own vanity and cruelty becoming the precise mechanism of its destruction. With the family dead and the house falling silent, the legend was about to solidify into its final form, but it would hold one last secret that would transform everything people thought they understood about the seamstress and her deadly needle. The story of Hester the seamstress has been told as a tale of individual brilliance and solitary vengeance. One woman's genius for turning domestic tools into instruments of death while maintaining perfect secrecy throughout months of planning. Popular accounts celebrate her as a lone figure who single-handedly destroyed her oppressors using nothing more than needle, thread, and an encyclopedic knowledge of poisonous plants. But the truth proves more complex and more threatening than the simplified legend that grew from it. Hester was never alone in her campaign of resistance. Every step of her plan required cooperation from others who shared her understanding of oppression and her hunger for liberation. Old May had provided not just botanical knowledge, but decades of accumulated wisdom about survival and resistance. Corinthia's role extended far beyond simple cooking, her position in the main house allowing her to monitor the family's health and adjust the timing of each phase. The network included others whose contributions were less visible but equally vital. Samuel, the stable hand, carried messages between plantations and provided information about escape routes. Ruth, who cleaned the main house, ensured that evidence was removed and suspicions were deflected. Even young children played their part, serving as observers and messengers in a system their masters never suspected existed. The boy who told Dr. Wells about seeing Hester singing to the close was not sharing a supernatural observation, but delivering a carefully crafted piece of misdirection designed to reinforce white stereotypes about slave superstition while deflecting investigation away from technical methods that could have been discovered and countered. Their goal was more sophisticated than simple revenge. By creating a supernatural explanation for the deaths, they ensured that the plantation would be seen as cursed, delaying creditors and slave traders long enough for most of the enslaved population to escape through underground railroad connections that had been carefully cultivated over years. The traveling preacher's letter, discovered decades later, mentions not just a seamstress angel, but her congregation, who had vanished northward in the chaos following the family's deaths. Census records from Pennsylvania and Canada include several families whose members share names with former Briarwood residents, suggesting that the escape was largely successful. The success of this strategy can be measured not only through the deaths of the Briar family, but through the number of people who successfully vanished during the chaos that followed. The Underground Railroad network in Virginia was far more extensive and sophisticated than historians had previously understood. The lone seamstress was a compelling myth that satisfied popular hunger for stories about individual heroism. But the truth revealed something far more threatening to systems of oppression: the existence of organized resistance networks capable of coordinated action against seemingly invincible power structures. The real story was not about one woman's skill with needle and thread, but about a community's collective determination to achieve freedom through careful planning, mutual support, and patient accumulation of small advantages. The truth was a tapestry woven by many hands, each contributing threads that were invisible individually, but created an unbreakable pattern when combined with the efforts of others who shared the same desperate hope for liberation. Eliza Breyer, the sole survivor of her family's mysterious decline, inherited an estate that had become synonymous with death and supernatural terror. Local residents spoke in whispers of the Briarwood curse, creating legends that effectively destroyed any possibility that the property could be sold for its actual value. The plantation's reputation for harboring malevolent forces made it essentially worthless despite its prime location and substantial acreage, forcing Eliza to accept offers that amounted to little more than the value of timber and building materials. The property that should have attracted serious investors was now avoided by rational people who preferred not to risk becoming victims of forces that seemed to operate outside normal understanding. The official records attribute the deaths to a contagious fever of unknown origin, possibly related to the plantation's proximity to swampland and miasmatic conditions thought to breed disease. Dr. Wells's final report emphasized environmental factors and hereditary weakness, carefully avoiding any suggestion of deliberate poisoning or supernatural intervention. The enslaved population was dispersed through forced sales to distant plantations, scattering the community that had harbored such dangerous knowledge. Buyers were eager to acquire experienced workers from a famous estate, unaware that they were purchasing individuals who had participated in the most sophisticated act of collective resistance in the region's history. The dispersal served multiple purposes beyond simply generating revenue to pay the estate's debts. It ensured that no concentration of potentially rebellious individuals remained intact, eliminated witnesses who might eventually reveal inconvenient truths, and satisfied the psychological need to take action against people who were suspected of involvement, even though no evidence could be produced. In the years that followed, similar mysterious deaths occurred at plantations throughout Virginia and the Carolinas, always involving families known for particular cruelty and often preceded by the arrival of skilled domestic workers. The pattern was subtle enough to avoid official notice, but clear enough to spread terror among slave owners who began viewing their most trusted workers with new suspicion. The phenomenon became known in whispered conversations as the Seamstress curse, though few people were willing to discuss it openly or acknowledge the possibility that enslaved people might be capable of such sophisticated planning. The alternative explanation, that supernatural forces were systematically targeting cruel masters, was actually more acceptable to most white Southerners than the terrifying possibility that their property had developed effective methods of resistance. Churches throughout Virginia began holding special services focused on the spiritual dangers of pride, vanity, and excessive cruelty toward subordinates. Ministers spoke carefully about divine justice and the mysterious ways that Providence worked to punish the wicked, allowing congregations to draw their own conclusions without stating anything inflammatory. The transformation of the Briarwood story from criminal investigation to supernatural legend served everyone's interests except historical accuracy. It allowed authorities to close an embarrassing case without admitting failure, provided white communities with explanations that preserved their sense of control, and created protective mythology that concealed the true extent of resistance networks throughout the region. But while official records preferred simple narratives of tragedy and divine retribution, the land itself and the memories of the displaced refused to cooperate with such convenient fabrications. Modern historians examining antebellum plantation records have noted the Briarwood case as part of an unusual pattern of unexplained deaths that clusters around estates known for exceptional cruelty. The phenomenon appears in academic studies of slave resistance, folklore collections, and medical histories as an example of how official records can obscure rather than illuminate historical truth. Similar stories emerge from archives throughout the former slave states, tales of mysterious illnesses that struck particularly cruel masters, of domestic workers whose skills seemed to extend beyond their assigned duties, of resistance networks that operated beneath official notice. The patterns suggest systematic organization rather than isolated incidents of individual revenge. Dr. Sarah Mitchell's groundbreaking research has documented over 40 similar incidents throughout the southeastern states between 1835 and 1860, all involving plantation families who died under circumstances that baffled contemporary physicians. The cases share characteristics that suggest coordination rather than coincidence. The pattern typically begins with the arrival of skilled domestic workers whose abilities exceed normal expectations, followed by the commissioning of elaborate wardrobes that require intensive labor over extended periods. The targeted families then suffer from mysterious wasting illnesses that resist conventional treatment while exhibiting characteristics suggesting exposure to unidentifiable toxic substances. Contemporary toxicologists have confirmed that the methods described in surviving documents would indeed be effective using plant materials native to the southeastern United States. The combination of contact poisons and inhaled irritants creates a delivery system that would be virtually undetectable, using medical knowledge available during the antebellum period. The sophistication of these resistance networks becomes apparent when researchers examine movement patterns of enslaved workers between plantations preceding mysterious deaths. Census records and estate inventories reveal complex webs of connection that allowed information and techniques to spread despite legal restrictions on slave movement and communication. Underground Railroad historians have traced several possible escape routes that could have been used by survivors, and Canadian immigration records include numerous families whose profiles match those of people who vanished from Virginia estates. The correlation suggests remarkable success in achieving the primary goal of facilitating mass liberation while creating supernatural explanations that protected participants. In 1955, Margaret Whitmore donated family papers to the Virginia Historical Society, including Eliza Breyer's complete diary with entries that had been missing from previous examinations. The material provided unprecedented insight into daily plantation life and relationships with enslaved workers that official records never documented. Contemporary analysis focuses on the psychological warfare employed against oppressor families, the manipulation of white stereotypes about slave ignorance and superstition, and the sophisticated understanding of human nature that made such elaborate deception possible. The resistance networks demonstrated remarkable ability to exploit their owners' blind spots while maintaining operational security. The story has found new relevance in discussions about hidden resistance and the complex ways that enslaved people fought back. Rather than viewing slavery as complete domination, scholars recognize it as constant struggle between oppressor and oppressed, with victory sometimes achieved through methods that left no obvious evidence. The case exhibits characteristics associated with serial killing, organized conspiracy, and domestic terrorism, categories that provide analytical tools for understanding the planning and execution involved. It has attracted attention from researchers studying the intersection of gender, race, and resistance, particularly how enslaved women used domestic roles to gather intelligence and create opportunities for resistance. The echoes ask us to listen closer to old stories, to hear not just the fear, but the agency in the silence. We do not know Hester's ultimate fate, though compelling evidence suggests that a woman matching her description lived as a free seamstress in Toronto until 1867, training other women in needlework arts that went far beyond simple sewing. Her son, Elijah, if he survived the journey north, would have grown to adulthood in freedom, carrying memories of a mother who transformed needles into weapons and cloth into instruments of justice. The physical evidence of the Briarwood deaths was systematically destroyed. The poisoned garments were burned as cursed objects, their ashes scattered to prevent contamination. The main house was eventually demolished, its materials sold to builders who constructed more mundane structures from the bones of the mansion. All that remains now is the story itself, passed down through whispered conversations and scholarly investigations, growing in power with each telling. The tale has evolved beyond its historical origins to become a legend of resistance, a reminder that even in systems designed to strip all power from the oppressed, the human will to fight back finds expression. What makes the story particularly haunting is not the sophistication of her methods or the completeness of her revenge, but the way she transformed the very symbols of her oppression into tools of liberation. The needle that had stitched her bondage became the instrument of her master's destruction. The skills valued only for service became weapons in a war the oppressors never knew they were fighting. The case demonstrates that resistance can take forms invisible to those in power, that the most dangerous weapons are sometimes hidden in beautiful packages, and that justice often wears the face of perfect service while concealing absolute rebellion. The seamstress understood that her master's greatest weakness was their inability to see her as fully human, and she used their blindness with devastating effectiveness. Before you go, subscribe and hit that notification bell if you want to hear more stories about the hidden history of resistance that shaped our nation. The truth is always more complex and powerful than the official version, and there are countless stories of ordinary people who found extraordinary ways to fight back. The clothes are ash, the people are dust, but the story of the seamstress who sewed with vengeance remains stitched into history itself. In a world where power seemed absolute and resistance impossible, she proved that the most dangerous threats often come from those who appear most submissive, that perfect service can mask perfect rebellion, and that justice, like a flawlessly crafted seam, remains invisible until the moment it holds everything together. Her legacy lives on in the understanding that oppression always creates its own opposition, that human dignity cannot be permanently suppressed, and that those who mistake survival for surrender do so at their peril. The seamstress and her deadly needle remind us that revolution sometimes comes not with guns and proclamations, but with patience, planning, and the transformation of everyday tools into instruments of liberation. The most profound revolutions are often the quietest ones, carried out by people whose names history never records, but whose actions echo across generations, inspiring others to recognize that even in the darkest circumstances, resistance remains possible for those with courage to thread the needle of justice and sew a different future with their own hands.